Let's go ahead and pray and then we'll start. Lord, thank you so much just for this opportunity we have. Thank you for your grace and your kindness given to us. Thank you for your word and your wisdom that guides us and instructs us on how to see life here under the sun. I pray, God, that this would be profitable and beneficial for us, and that overall, Lord, you would be glorified. We thank you so much for who you are and for what you do. For it's in your son's name. Amen. Okay. We are continuing our discourse in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verses 2 to 7. Let's go ahead and review basically the conclusion of what we've been talking about over the past several weeks. We're coming up to the end here of Ecclesiastes. And so let's go ahead and underscore this. So we've been looking at basically the entire book of Ecclesiastes as Koheleth's research proposal. Essentially, his observations of the activities of humanity as a whole and what he is concluding from these activities. We see the introduction in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1. This is, again, giving this introduction or this examining of why this observation of humanity by Koheleth ought to be completed and why it is important that we understand this. Then we have the literature review. That is a description of what is known about the area of research. Koheleth brings up the cycle of life, the cycle of nature, the cycle of just the creative processes, that there's nothing new under the sun, that old things are just, or new things are old things with new names. That's basically what they are. And if that is the case, then I think so. I am. Am I not showing up? I'm not there. Maybe it is Facebook. I thought it was already up.
You're on YouTube though? Yeah. I say we keep going. We'll blow it up later.
Okay. So if that's the case, that things are not new, and if things continue to keep repeating, if old things have just new names, then what is the purpose of living? That is the rationale. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 13 to 14, Koheleth begins to describe the importance of why this topic or the subject needs to be explored. Then we get to the method and design. The method and design is Ecclesiastes chapters 2 and 8, where Koheleth goes through all of these subjects and all of these topics and all of these activities. He even includes himself in this and concludes using method, design, and procedure, analyzing all of the data and concluding all of these particular thoughts about how one ought to fear God, and that really activities in and of themselves are useless. Now we come to the significance and conclusion out of looking at all of the data, all of the analyzation, all of the information, and all of these things from chapters 2 and 8. Looking at all of this data, what are we to conclude from this text, right? What are we to conclude looking at all of these activities that occur under the sun? Koheleth sums up all of this in his analysis. Last week, we focused on a single statement, and that was verse 1 of chapter 11. And we had looked at many different explanations of this particular chapter, or this particular verse in this chapter. And I concluded that based upon some of the language and how it is used, that it's not underscoring, casting your sin out onto the waters. It's not underscoring generosity directly per se. It's not underscoring what one actually ought to do, casting their bread upon the waters, and they'll find it after many days. But I'm convinced that it's actually talking about one's personal perspective, just about their life. Koheleth, in speaking to the congregation of Israel in terms of their outlook, ought to live carefree and not guard things and their needs and their lives so tightly. I mentioned that if one has this particular perspective or this outlook, that it may lead to them being generous. But according to the wisdom of Koheleth, if anyone does not do this, this was an imperative, by the way, he tells them to cast their bread on the waters. This is not a suggestion. That one who doesn't have this is thinking improperly about their life, that they should not hold on to things too tightly. Now we get to verse 2 of Ecclesiastes. We will go to verse 7. We will not finish this chapter this morning because the last three statements Koheleth makes I want to spend some time on. So we'll talk about that one, Lord willing, next week. Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 2. He says this: divide your portion to 7 to 8, or even to 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. Let's take a look at a couple of words here within this text. The Hebrew word for divide is natan. This word appears real frequently, as a matter of fact. It's one of the most common words that are used in the Hebrew scriptures. 2,000 times it occurs in the Hebrew scriptures from Genesis all the way to Malachi. The Hebrew word appears 25 times in the book of Ecclesiastes alone. Okay. The word for divide in this term is in the qual stem, or the active. Okay. It expresses an active action. It means to give, put, or set in place. This word is also an imperative, much like verse 1. Okay. So again, this is an instruction that Koheleth is giving based upon the information that he's been observing. So to give or to set 7 or even 8, for you do not know what misfortune, right? You do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. Misfortune is the Hebrew word ra. 663 times it appears in the Hebrew scriptures. This word is a common word that's used in the book of Ecclesiastes as well. 31 times it occurs as well. This word is a noun, and a feminine noun at that, which underscores its translation. It is usually translated as bad or evil if it's used this particular way, if it's this noun. Within this context, misfortune is not talking about necessarily evil in terms of one's actions towards another. That's not what it's talking about here. In this context, this word is talking about events that cause sorrow or distress in a particular individual. We usually say that in our culture when something happens. Oh man, that was bad. That was bad that happened, right? The event is not sentient, right? It doesn't have a will or a desire. It is just something that happens that's unfortunate for us. This is that word that's being used here in this context. So what is the point of Koheleth's thought here? Is divide your portion to the 7 or even to the 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. Well, we have a similar expression in our culture. Have we ever heard the phrase, hey, don't put all your eggs in one basket? That's literally what the expression is, very similar. Koheleth underscores the importance of a person spreading out their share or their portion. So when unfortunate things happen, it will prevent distress. Compared to a person who places all of their share or eggs in one place. I find this to be very interesting, as a matter of fact. In Ecclesiastes chapter 11, there's a lot of these pithy sayings, right? We have them in our culture too. I just shared one of them. This is that chapter. He's going to give us all of these little pithy quotes, right? These quotes underscore all the things that he's talked about for the past 10 chapters. This one has to do with essentially savings, diversifying, if you will. And when unfortunate things happen, you won't find yourself in a more precarious situation. In Ecclesiastes 3, we continue. He mentions this: if the clouds are full, they will pour out rain upon the earth. And whether a tree falls toward the south or towards the north, wherever a tree falls, there it lies. No kidding, right? That's where it is. No kidding. Why would Koheleth say this in this text, in this section? Well, once more, Koheleth uses the example of nature. As a matter of fact, he uses it all throughout this chapter. Casting your bread on the water, so to speak. And now he's talking about two particular things, two particular examples to underscore a main point that I'm convinced he'll make later on in this chapter. In the statement, he uses storm clouds that produce rain. Pretty self-explanatory. If the clouds are full, they'll pour rain on the earth, right? It's pretty self-explanatory. And the example too, if a tree falls in a direction, wherever the tree falls, there it lies. What in the world is this? Well, if you think about it, can you control storm clouds? You can't control those, right? You can't control how much rain it produces either, right? Or lack thereof. If a tree falls in the north and the south, can you really stop that? No, you can't stop that. Can you control what direction it falls? Can you lift it and move it somewhere by yourself? No, probably not. What does this mean? These natural observations are obvious. They're evident. Storm clouds produce rain and trees lay after they fall. No kidding. Again, once more, based upon the language and particularly the context of this chapter, I'm convinced that these statements discuss really the inevitableness of all things that occur in life. That human beings really, we don't have any control or very little control of anything. Just like human beings don't have any control over the activity of the clouds or where a tree falls and where it lies. Again, this is about outlook. This is about perspective. We cannot control the events that happen in our lives. Most of them we cannot. Maybe we're healthy one day and sick the next. We have all this money one day and not the next. We may make investments and lose those. We may have unexpected things happen to us that we were not anticipating. We don't have any control over those. Just like we don't have any control over the clouds that have rain and they fall, or a tree where it lies. We have no control over those. So let's go on to chapter 11, verse 4. What does this mean? He who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. So after Koheleth tells us that we really have no control over some of the events or some of the activities that occur under the sun at the hands of men, he says this. Once more, Koheleth is using nature to talk about a particular type of person, he who watches. This is talking about a particular type of individual. This is not talking about just anyone, but the type of person who watches the wind. They are, in effect, unproductive. They are lazy. They are wind watchers, right? By the way, Koheleth has underscored this in other books and in other places. For instance, in Proverbs 20, verse 4, he uses the idea of the sluggard. The sluggard does not plow after autumn, so he begs during the harvest and has nothing. He does not work in the autumn time, and now he has to go out and beg because he did not produce anything, right? In Proverbs 22:13, this is probably one of my favorite verses. The sluggard says, hey, there's a lion outside. I will be killed in the streets. I can't go out there. Someone might kill me, right? A lazy individual, a person who watches the wind, spends their time focusing on unproductive things. They do not labor. As a matter of fact, they find labor as a huge burden to them, right? It gets in the way. Now, in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, there's also another consideration about Koheleth's statement that I think we ought to consider. I'll read it again. It says, he who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. They spend their time cloud gazing. There's another consideration about Koheleth's statement. This statement, I believe, underscores that those who have this particular character, this particular type of perspective, this outlook, neglect that labor and work is a gift of God for humankind. To labor and to work is actually a service that one does for another. There is a lot of talk about that going around too, about labor being a curse, being a burden, labor being it's a curse for all of us. That's not true in the biblical perspective. It is not true. It is a gift of God for humanity. It is part of our activity that we do. And it's part of our activity that we do to the service of others. Many vocations are for the neighbor. For instance, Koheleth underscores this in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 12 to 13. He goes, I know that there's nothing better for them to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. Not just the eating and drinking is the gift, but all of it. Even the labor that produces the eating and drinking. That is a gift of God as well. Don't believe me. I understand. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 18 to 19 says this as well. Koheleth, in his observations, he says, here's what I've seen to be good and fitting. Remember, the term I have seen is something that he inspects to be good. Tov. That word is agathos in the Greek, by the way. Qualitatively good in the sight of God. Good and appropriate to eat, to drink, and enjoy oneself in all one's labor, in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life, of which God has given him. For this is his share, or his reward. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. Labor is not a curse. Work is not a curse. It may be hard, difficult, depending on what we choose to do. But labor is not a curse. It is not. It is a gift of God for us to do. And consequently, those who cloud gaze refuse to accept this. Let's continue to Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 5. Just as you do not know the path of the wind, or how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God, who makes all things. Koheleth, again, I find this very fascinating that Koheleth is using creation to underscore perspective. This is fascinating to me. So far, he's used the water, he's used rain clouds, he's used the falling of trees, and now he's using the path of the wind and conception. I think we miss a lot about creation and how it's to give us proper perspective, particularly in terms of Koheleth. Koheleth is not saying anything new. Matter of fact, Job said this earlier, prior to Koheleth. Ask the beast and they'll teach you, right? Again, Koheleth, using the activity of creation, the path of the wind, and the development of bones in the act of conception to associate this to the activity of God. For we do not know, we are not aware of the activity of God who makes all things. Now, again, I mentioned this before. We have the complete revelation of the will and the desire of God, either holding it in our hands or on our smartphones and tablets and our electronic devices. So what does he mean? You do not know the activity of God who makes all things when we have it here. It's really fast. It's really simple. You don't know, and I don't know the activity of God in relation to our personal life. We do not know that. You cannot look into the future a year from now and find out what happens to you. I wish that were the case. That'd be kind of fun. Oh, well, depending on who you are, right? In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11, he underscores this point. He's made everything appropriate in its time. He's also set eternity in their hearts so that man will not find out the work which God has done from beginning even to the end. We talked about this, that God has established reality to work a certain way. We can't go beyond that, right? We have to live in the reality that he's established with the activities that he's given us to complete and to do. But we will not find out what our personal life will look like. That information is not open to us. Same thing that he mentions in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 14. But in the day of prosperity be happy, but in the day of adversity consider God has made the one as well as the other, so that man will not discover anything that will be after him. God has made both times of goodness and times of hardship for the mere purpose that we do not know our personal life and where it leads, that we do not assume that. Again, if you want a more full description of that, go back to Ecclesiastes 7. I cover that in great detail. In verse 6 of Ecclesiastes, since we do not know the activity of God in regards to how our personal life will lead, where we will go, where we will end up. Remember, James talks about this, right? You do not know where, let's go spend a year there, make a profit, things like that. You don't even know if you'll be alive tomorrow. How do you know that, right? So, because of this, let's look at verse 6. Sow your seed in the morning And do not be idle in the evening, for you do not know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed, or whether both of them alike will be good. Let's dive into this a little deeper. The term be idle is the Hebrew word yana. Okay? Be idle. The Hebrew word appears 75 times in the Hebrew scriptures, 6 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Okay? It's usually translated to leave up, right? Or to lay. Okay? To leave, to leave up, or to lay. Right? This word is a verb, essentially, and it's in the hifil stem. The hifil stem is the causative of the verb that's in the qual active. So whatever verb is in the active stem, the qual stem in the Hebrew, this stem is the causative of that. Okay? For example, this is the Hebrew text. Of course, we read from right to left. In this text, this word sow is the qual. Okay, so in the morning, sow your seed, right? And in the evening, not do be idle. This word is in the hifil stem. That so connects with that word there. That is the causative. So don't be idle when you're sowing your seed, particularly in the evening. Okay? Now, what's interesting about this word is also in the jussive. And we know about the jussive. The jussive is not strong enough to be an imperative, and it is not weak enough to be a suggestion. So we would translate this as ought. You ought not to be idle, okay, in the evening, because you do not know the outcome. Again, once more, we have a saying in our culture that is associated somewhat with this statement that Koheleth makes. Again, Koheleth, using the example of agriculture, sowing your seed in the ground, watering it, tending to it, right, discusses a person's intent. Again, our saying in our culture, late to bed, early to rise, right? That's kind of the idea. Once more, this is not expressing that one needs to be a farmer. Thank God for that, because I am not farming, okay? I'm not. I appreciate the farmers who bring the food to the market so I could purchase it. I'm not doing that, right? But I appreciate those who do. But one ought to be productive in their activity. That's the point. This is somewhat associated with the previous statement that talks about laziness. One who sows their seed in the morning and in the evening, they don't got time to be looking at clouds, right? They don't got time to be looking at the wind. That's not what they're doing. Koheleth gives the reason for this perspective. Why does he give the reason? Because a person does not have knowledge if their efforts will be successful or not. This underscores something that's very, very important, particularly in our culture right now, that we ought to be diligent because we have the opportunity, but we are not guaranteed success. The very fact that one has opportunity should motivate one to labor well, because we do not know if we are going to be successful or not. One cannot control the yield of production, but they can control their effort and time they spent in that activity. Ain't that the truth? I can't control how successful I may get, but I can control the effort of what I put in. I can control that. I cannot control the activity of God. I can't control that, but I can control my perspective in it, though. I can control that. I cannot control the outcome of my effort, but I can control my effort. That is super cool, because it really shows that in one sense, my perspective in life is what I make of it. That we don't have to be subject to failures and things. We don't just have to give ourselves over to that. That's really neat. Which brings us to verse 7 of Ecclesiastes. This is kind of neat. The light is pleasant, and it is good for the eyes to see the sun. Well, what does this mean? Again, this is one of Koheleth's pithy sayings, right? Why do I have this here? There we go. Okay. Light is the Hebrew word or. It appears 121 times in the Hebrew scriptures, 3 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's really just it's really kind of easy. It's translated lights, light or lights, right? Really easy. This word is also used in a figurative and non-figurative way. And it's also, again, it's used 3 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. We've seen this before. As a matter of fact, in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 13, we see that Koheleth compares light to darkness in an association with wisdom and folly. He says this, and I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. He comes to the conclusion that wisdom is objectively advantageous. It is better than folly, right? Just as light excels darkness. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 2, he talks about the sun and the light, right? That reflects, that comes from the sun. Talking about the lights in the sky, the luminaries. We'll get to what this is talking about later on. We're almost there in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 2. But he uses the same word here, or. The word pleasant, that is the result of being in the light, is the Hebrew word matak. It appears 12 times in the Hebrew text, 2 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, and really this word is translated as sweet. Okay? Sweet. They translated, my scripture translated as pleasant, but it literally means sweet. And depending on the context, it could be talking about something that has a delightful flavor, right? Like honey, right? Or something that is sweet to the taste. It can also be used to discuss when one has a peaceful attitude or disposition. They are sweet, or they are pleasant. They're sweet to be around, right? Let's talk about how Koheleth uses this in Ecclesiastes right quick. In Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 2, he uses this phrase talking about the sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich man does not allow him to sleep. Once again, Koheleth is talking about perspective here. Remember how one is to rejoice in their labor, right? When one has a perspective of rejoicing in their labor, it doesn't matter how much he consumes. The sleep of a working man is pleasant to him because he has a proper perspective. While the full stomach of the rich man, you would think that he wouldn't have any problems, right? But the one who holds or adores their money, that's all they can think about, and that keeps them up at night, even if their stomach is full, right? Ayin is the Hebrew word for eyes. 897 times it occurs in the Hebrew scriptures. 10 times it occurs in the book of Ecclesiastes. It is translated as eyes or sight. Okay? This Hebrew word is used in a figurative and non-figurative way. And this word can be used to talk about either one's physical sight that they see, or it can talk about one's insight. Very fascinating. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 10, Koheleth, in being a little snarky, says, the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. The wise man's eyes, well, both of them have eyes to see, right? Well, he's using this as an example that those who are wise see clearly, while those who are foolish are blind, right? He's using the example of sight to show the outcome of it, of both the foolish man and the wise man. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 14, Koheleth literally talks about his physical sight and what that motivated him to do. All that my eyes desired, all that they saw, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all of my labor, and this was the reward for my labor. Right? This is one of the reasons why he looks at labor as being somewhat content about that. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 8, speaking about the individual who loves money, the one who adores it, he says, there was a certain man without a dependent, neither having a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all of his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied. His eyes were not satisfied. What do you mean his eyes were not satisfied? His eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? Well, we don't talk like that. Usually we talk, well, they weren't satisfied, right? But he's talking about his eyes. Everything that he saw did not bring him any contentment because his gaze was fixed on his riches, right? This too is vanity, and it is a grievous task. The word for son in chapter 11, verse 7, is the word shemesh. Shemesh. It appears 134 times in the Hebrew scriptures, 35 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. So this is a common phrase, and it's translated son. And of course, every time this word is used, particularly in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is the focal point of our discussion, it is discussing the physical luminary in the sky. That's all it's talking about. Okay? Under the sun, right? The activity of men under the sun. This is talking about that luminary here. The statement of Koheleth here, combining all of this, really, the light is pleasant, and it is good for the eyes to see the sun. You know, this is something that, again, we can underscore and relate to in our culture as well, right? We see this in a lot symbolically in movies, right? Particularly when there's dark times and things like that, and all of a sudden the sun rises. That offers hope, of course, right? Whenever someone is depressed, what do we always tell them? Hey, why don't you go outside, get some fresh air, get some sun. It's good for you, right? This is somewhat the statement of Koheleth as well. Some physical advice or counsel from Koheleth. Koheleth emphasizes that going outside and getting sunshine is qualitatively good. Told. I find that to be interesting for one to do. Again, this underscores the overall statement of Koheleth throughout this discourse, is that a person ought to enjoy and find satisfaction in their physical life. To not just enjoy your life and what God has given you, but to enjoy creation itself, particularly by means of the sun. It is good for you. If you are sad, if you are troubled, go for a walk out in the sun, because it's pleasant for you. It's sweet. So far, let's take a look at the nuggets that we have in chapter 11. These, in one sense, we would call these common sense things, but they're common sense in light of what? The wisdom of God. These aren't things that are just brought up by Koheleth because they're sayings of the culture. These pithy statements that Koheleth has underscore something about the reality of how God has created us and the world around us. That having a carefree perspective or attitude in our lives is a good thing. Not to hold things so tightly. Well, why is that? Because there are unfortunate things that happen to us. We don't know where our life is going to be 5 years from now, a year from now, next week. We don't know. So we ought to live with a carefree attitude and a perspective. To prepare for unfortunate times in one's life and in ours. To be mindful about those things. But to also understand, too, that when these unfortunate times happen, they're not because God is out to get us. That's not it. It's because welcome to life, right? This is what we have. And so to understand that a person cannot control all events, we can try like we like, but we're going to end up completely frustrated. We're going to end up very embittered. To understand also, too, that the work of God in a person's personal life is not available to them. This is why one of the reasons why Koheleth says, well, why are the former days better than these? And he mentions it's not by wisdom that you ask this, right? Our personal life is not available to us. God did not give us that revelation regarding us, but what he has given us is enough for our outlook, for all things, particularly Ecclesiastes. That a person ought to live intentionally. How many times have I said this, man, over the course of this discourse, man? I mean, it's like all over the place. Koheleth writes, to live intentionally and not develop a lazy, unproductive character. Particularly if you don't know what unfortunate events are going to happen to you, right? You want to labor with the opportunities that you have. Seize those. And also understanding that even though you seize them, you're not guaranteed success. So work well. And lastly, that a person ought to care for and find satisfaction for themselves physically, particularly by getting some sun, going out and walking in the sun, because it is qualitatively good for you and me to do so. Is this why, Will, you told me this was your favorite chapter. Is this why this is? It's becoming one of my favorite chapters too. It is amazing. Pithy sayings and quotes summed up by the conclusion that Koheleth makes of all the activities under the sun. What an amazing chapter. We're not done, Lord willing. We will continue and finish up in chapter 11. Let's pray. Lord, in a lot of ways, this book reminds me of Philippians. To have a proper outlook about your word, about life here under the sun. That labor is not a terrible thing. It is a thing that you have given to us for us to serve our neighbor. That we cannot know our personal lives, but what we do have is sufficient for us to have proper perspective about our personal lives. Thank you so much for the wisdom that you've given to us. I know personally, I take it for granted. Sometimes, often. Thank you for reminding me of this wisdom and the outlook that I ought to have concerning life here, until such time your Son appears. Amen.